I think that's a little bit better in terms of ease of being able to see the screen. Firstly, I'd like to thank those of you who are joining us both for the live LinkedIn broadcast as well as the fact that this will be recorded and made available for some to be able to come back and see based on their schedule and availability. I'm excited to be able to cover this topic and anxious to see if you're in a position that this can be of assistance to you, because unfortunately, way too many organizations right now are finding that their budgets are in jeopardy when it comes to this topic of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Let me give you a little bit of my background. For 20 years, I was fortunate to serve as a director and diversity strategist at the University of Houston's International Institute for Diversity and Cross-Cultural Management. I tell folks all the time it was a mouthful to have to answer the phone with. I was fortunate enough to be there from the late 90s all the way up through 2020 when I relocated from Texas into Central Florida. Was actually heading into Johannesburg before COVID hit, but that's another conversation. I've done this work globally, have been very fortunate to assist organizations in multiple parts of the world with this topic and this work. I also, at the university, created the first certificate program offered to diversity professionals by a college or university here in the U.S. And in that role, I had literally a couple of hundred people or more that were diversity managers, directors, VPs, CDOs, who came through the certificate program to gain the competencies to be able to do the work. I also was in a position where I was fortunate enough to work for Dr. George Gamble, who is a distinguished professor in accounting and taxation at the University of Houston. And his emphasis was always around the fact that if this work doesn't make dollars, then it doesn't make sense. Because if you can't connect this to the business of the business, the only way organizations will commit is when they are profitable. That as soon as the economy tightens up, they start to see where their cost centers versus profit centers are. So I began putting work in play, which I'm sharing with you today, on what I'm calling the diversity profit equation. I also have another metric called the diversity earnings per share factor. What this does is it connects the equity programs that organizations put in place to either the top line revenue growth, the bottom line cost reductions, or the pipeline recruiting, retention, and talent management in fiscally quantifiable ways. I also do lots of public speaking on this topic, quite often at SHRM chapters, and of late I've done a few corporate retreats where the leadership teams are being asked to hear this conversation about the metrics when some of those in talent, HR, or diversity hear this conversation, but would rather I have the discussion with their leaders than they, to tee up why is this a fiscal connection and how do you quantify it. I've also been fortunate because of a topic that's really personal for me, which is bullying in the workplace. I've done quite a bit of work in that area. I've had the fortune to do a half-hour special on PBS on the topic, a special on Al Jazeera America. I've been on all of the local affiliates when I lived in Houston, from CBS to Fox to NBC. I have a bullying book that I was hoping to have finished this quarter, but things are just getting kind of hectic for me. I do have another book that I'm not selling. It's just one that I wrote to capture my thoughts in all of this work. It's called Being Tolerant is for Cowards. And the subtitle is Leadership Thinking to Disrupt the Status Quo with Purpose. Self-published. To be very candid, if anybody's interested, I'll send you an electronic version of it free. I didn't write it for the purpose of selling the book and making money. But continuing, we've got about 10 pounds of stuff to put in a 5-pound bag, as my dad used to say. Here's my logo sheet, and the intent with this is just to give you some insights around some of the organizations with whom I've done this work for. It's not intended to provide a endorsement, if you would, from these entities, but just to show the depth and breadth of the work and how many entities are still leaning in on this topic as well. I'm now a part of Blue Beyond Consulting, and I've had a number of people who have reached out to ask me, tell me more about Blue Beyond. I love this organization. They were founded in, you can see, in 2006. A little over 100 employees, 200 plus clients, woman-owned, certified with great places to work. But what I really love is the culture and their outlook on becoming that trusted advisor with clients to engage and help them move the needle on an array of topics well beyond just diversity. And here's the irony: they have clients that have been with them since they started in 2006 and have been doing work with them every single year since then. Just to give you some insights of our capabilities, we do quite a bit of culture work. Our work is rooted in deep trust and high expectations and the connection between those. We do a lot of work around organizational effectiveness, talent. We have an incredible communications team and a visual comms team that's probably about a dozen plus people. We also do a lot of change management work in helping organizations establish their employee value propositions and more. My role is helping the organization build this equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging practice, and I'm really excited to be a part of the team. So let's jump in and get started. What's driving the conversation that I want you to hear today? The recession is a part of it. Layoffs and downsizing and budget reductions are inevitable and going to become even more prevalent. The gains that diversity, equity, and inclusion have made are in jeopardy of being reduced. It's not just my perspective. Here's some headlines. Recent headlines, I say recent in July and August. Now in September and October, with the new economic numbers coming out, there are even more headlines. This one was referencing how with the increased wave of layoffs in the tech space, downsizing is going to have an impact on diversity and inclusion. An article in the Harvard Business Review talked about don't let layoffs undermine your DEI efforts. And the tech industry is in the crosshairs because they've been making some progress lately, but more articles were coming out in that July and August window. Now, it's not even industry specific. It's everywhere relative to this trend that's coming, and the diversity gains and budgets are dramatically being impacted. So, my question is, where are you on this metrics journey? The 20 years that I spent at the University of Houston, I literally was market facing, but had the ability to work with an incredible depth of very brilliant people. And the context of what we were looking at around metrics and things of that sort was to move the work from the early continuum stage where you're measuring things like demographic changes. How many of which category do you have? Are there generational concerns in the workplace? And these are things that most in the early adapter stage, if you would, to use that vernacular, begin to measure and quantify these types of metrics. And then they'll start to sort of branch out a little and start measuring activities. Like if there's workshops that are being offered or training or webinars, even though they may not be mandatory and they're strongly encouraged, what percentage of a particular team or division or department are participating? Do you have employee resource groups? Are they becoming more business resource group than employee resource group? And just a quick touch note, that's a topic that is becoming resonant as the organizations start to tighten their budgets as well. Because if they see your ERG as primarily focused on celebrations and holidays, as the economy starts to tighten up, the bosses, those supervisors of the members of these ERGs, when now the comment is, I'm heading to a meeting with the Hispanic or African American, or pick any attribute of difference, and that ERG, the response as the numbers of employees get to be fewer and fewer, and the workloads go up because of the recession that's pending, the response from a lot of supervisors will be, are you really sure that's something you need to do right now? We got so much work to do. And that's a part of the branding and the way we're seen doing the celebrations as the core focus. That's why a lot of organizations are switching to BRGs. I'm going to also bring up the metrics connected to how BRGs are leveraging resources. What else are you measuring? Are you becoming a little bit more in the depth of the stream of the work? Are you, looking at talent-specific metrics? Are you looking at hiring rates and retention rates and promotion rates? Have you taken a look at your applicant tracking system to see, is there some form of cognitive bias that comes into play from where your ATS may have a 50% mix of BIPOC employee candidates who all meet the qualifications, but less than 5 to 10% are actually being offered jobs? These are the kinds of things that people are starting to measure and quantify, and I'm going to bring the dollars and cents to it. Are you looking at how does revenue growth allow you to track the connections to your DEIB programs? What are you doing from a cost reduction or margin enhancement standpoint that can be linked to your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts? How do you address these conversations internally? Do you discuss these issues with leadership in ways that are connected to EBITDA, to earnings per share, to environmental, social, and governance goals that now they're being asked by stakeholders to explain and identify how they're going to reach and exceed the expectations. If you're not connecting those measures to financial performance, then for the majority of executives, they're not going to be able to manage it if you can't measure it. Let me continue relative to the continuum. I asked earlier, what are you measuring? Well, a part of that really is contingent on where are you in this continuum of the work. Just as in the Marketing 101 class where you heard the discussion of the bell curve that had early adapters that bought the iPhone 97 the day it came out. And then you had the laggards, if you would, that waited until the product became commoditized and now they were buying the Walmart version of the phone that's 13 years old. Here's my point. There is a curve relative to where you are on the continuum in this work. There's multiple ways people explain this. This is the way I've adapted what I do in this work to it. Firstly, when it comes to the measures and the things that drive the work, if you are responding from some legal driver of some sort, something that may be compliance related or reactive to issues that are occurring, which unfortunately there are many, as common courtesy has become a lot less common anymore. If those are the kinds of ways you're responding, or you're transitioning into a little bit more of the values-driven approach, where now we acknowledge that we are bringing people in who may not be a part of our normal mix of the employee population from a gender or ethnicity or generational standpoint, but then we have to start linking our values to the environment that this changed employee population is now working in. These are the kinds of things that those early stage deployments of metrics and ways you quantify begin. But the line of demarcation in switching on this metrics journey from what would be best practiced to best in class and moving into the areas that should be the target for most organizations is now you're starting to measure things like the goals around talent and connecting them to performance. You're integrating that to your recruiting and retention goals, understanding how does that correlate to performance and behaviors in the workplace. You're now, from a best-in-class perspective, connecting the metrics and what you do to your succession planning and the ways in which your skill sets are being implemented from a emotional and social intelligence and intercultural agility standpoint, which I'll share more on that later. The context of where this is intended to show is what you measure will vary depending on where your organization is on the continuum. So, why is it that behaviors are so important in the context of what I'm attempting to share when it comes to these metrics? Because behaviors are something that HR has administered appropriate and inappropriate behaviors for years. But when it comes to the ways in which we talk about diversity, we way too often will shift from a focus on what people do and how they behave to what they believe and what they think. What people believe is not any employer's business. How they behave is different. And the behaviors are becoming increasingly more disrespectful. And the reason it's important is employees in the workplace are changing. Just a quick demographic number, according to the U.S. Department of Labor, as of today in the United States, over 75% of people entering the workforce are either women, immigrants, or people of color. So becoming diverse is not an option, it's an inevitability. And that diversity means when these disrespectful behaviors occur, people react differently. Here's some examples. In some of our quantitative data, what we found when we were looking at specific behaviors and how people responded and cut and sieved the data by those respondents, we found as an example that Hispanic employees were 3 times more likely than Caucasian employees to leave because expectations aren't being clearly communicated. 66% more likely to leave from witnessing too many acts of disrespectful behavior. African American employees were 50% more likely than Caucasians to leave due to not getting along with their supervisor, and 92% more likely than Caucasian employees to leave from witnessing too many acts of disrespectful behavior. Now, this was the quantitative analysis. Keep in mind, there were other data points that we were able to do correlations in this data. We found that there were significant links between the prevalence of the behaviors, the propensity to leave, the likelihood that effort was going to be diminished to do what was required, and a number of other metrics which we'll talk about here in a second. But I want you to see that this is where we began to, at least peel back the layer on the different experiences and why behaviors are so important. So what we did is we did a baseline study that we completed several different longitudinal attempts at it to see how the needle was moving. And what we looked at were things like acts of incivility and bullying and micro inequities. I'll explain some of these more in just a second. We wanted to know if these behaviors, derailing in nature, were occurring in an organization. Was there a correlation between the prevalence of these behaviors and other metrics that we could quantify? Was effort in the workplace affected? Was there an impact in turnover? Were there correlations between lost revenue on a per FTE basis? Was absenteeism associated? How about safety incidents? When you think about it logically, it would make sense. If somebody had just committed some egregiously disrespectful behavior, and now you're heading back to your desk or heading back to your workstation in a plant, your mind isn't on that drawer that might be partially out that you trip over, or the cord that might be laying in the way in the plant as you're walking by. We were able to discern that it wasn't just an assumption, but that there are data points to validate. We also wanted to make the connection to, as I said, top line, bottom line, and pipeline. The quantitative tool that we use is called the Organizational Inclusion Inventory. And this particular tool allows us to measure the amount of effort employees give at work, the frequency of safety incidents, and connecting this to sick days and company medical expenses, the impact on unexcused absences, and an array of other things that can be fiscally quantified, including innovation and creativity. And again, I'll share some of the numbers as we walk through this model. So the key for you as a HR talent or diversity lead is making sure that as you present the fiscal approach that involves these numbers, you need a better understanding of who your stakeholders are. Those board members and customers and clients are now putting more pressure on organizations, if you're business to business in particular, to lean in on doing things connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion and documenting them. Shareholders are asking, what is the organization doing? Institutional investors, and there's an entire body of what are called SRIs, or socially responsible investors. I'll touch on that in a moment as well. There's a demand on the part of employees now coming in to see what are you doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and especially the generational differences that are asking to know this before they become a part of your organization. It's important to have those touch points. When I talk about stakeholder expectations, there are ways in which now that board that's responsible for increasing the opportunity to acquire a company or a market now has the ethical and business responsibilities to connect how are you addressing the environmental, social, and governance issues and your DEIB programs to be consistent with best practices. So again, these are the kinds of relationships you need to have your finger on the pulse of when it comes to knowing who those stakeholders are. So let's begin to start framing a little bit on where are those buckets, if you would, around the fiscal connections. Top line, you've heard me mention. When I talk about the connections from a top line standpoint, I'm not just talking about if you happen to be in the consumer market and the majority of your products go to the general consumer market and not to a diverse constituent group. Clearly, a way traditionally to grow the top line would be to have a market share commensurate with any segment of who you sell your product to across all aspects. So that's not where I'm going with this. I want to talk about some non-traditional revenue aspects of how do we connect this to earnings as well as the ROI conversation. I mentioned innovation and creativity. I'm going to share with you in a few minutes some specific touch points in a survey that we use, and we were able to discern that there were significant amounts of suggestions and ideas in the body of employees and organizations around things like product enhancements and ways to increase revenue and improve quality and enhance customer service. And you'll be surprised at what happens with those ideas. I mentioned ERGs and BRGs. They're being used as profit centers in organizations in incredible ways. There is an organization in the Houston community that I worked with to help put together a quarterly event where the African American ERG that was connected to a business services group was actually hosting receptions to other African American ERGs and the clients that they were looking to develop relationships with. So if they were looking to get a bigger footprint in the manufacturing area, they reached out to the African American ERGs in every manufacturer in the community, invited them to the upscale business center with all the fancy leather and cherry wood, and I would come in and do a professional development session on how to grow your career or something that was of interest to everyone in the room. But now the relationships were in place. And some of those same relationships now, when the person trying to expand in that market, looking for a contact in that company, couldn't get a response, they called the African American ERG internally and got an introduction and a dinner meeting and were able to validate up to 7 figures annually worth of revenue. That's just one snippet of an example. Profit centers are being connected to BRGs and ERGs because it's also connected to the business of the business. I mentioned the issue around socially responsible investors. That's a segment of the community of investors. The largest of them is a group called Calvert at calvert.org, that they represent a cumulative body of about 700 investors that represent about $3 trillion worth of assets. And before they will invest in any company looking to grow their market share or tap the markets for additional funds, the first thing that they look at is to see, does the charter language for public companies, does the charter language of your board say that if there's an empty seat on the board, that a diverse slate of candidates will be reviewed for any board seat that becomes available? If something as simple as that language isn't in your charter, they tell all 700 plus of the SRIs that they're not going to make an investment in your organization. This is an issue that's important in so many ways. Pipeline, I mentioned in addition to top line. Customers are changing. The RFPs, if you're business to business, are changing. Companies are asking in the bids for your diversity strategy. And if you're not interacting with your sales teams to know how they're responding, most sales leads, when they turf up a deal or go to your website, cut and paste something, drop it in and send it off. But if it's a weighted component in the bid, as it is becoming more of that, because I've actually helped companies to develop that weighting structure, now that could be 5 points that could make a difference in winning or losing, depending on your industry and what you do. An average deal could be a couple of mil, 20 mil, 50 mil. You know your deals better than I. If the investment took, even hypothetically, $500,000 to get up to snuff, and that made a difference in landing 1 or 2 deals, that's an ROI any executive worth their salt would make. So context-wise, know that there are customer demands changing. Stakeholders are asking, what are you doing? There are implications when you're hiring now that people are using Myers-Briggs and Berkman and DISC and Insight to try to sort and sieve the right fit, if you would, which presents diversity implications as well, be aware of. When you start looking at the other ways in which the fiscal links can be quantified, it now can be linked to workplace behaviors I'll share, connections to absenteeism, and a number of other financial metrics that have an ability to justify budget and headcount. Let's take a closer look at the model now. You heard me talk about the diversity profit equation. There's several components of it. Firstly, there's the revenue growth that's connected to diversity-related issues, cost reduction, the factors that are associated with acts of incivility, metrics that I'll just deem as intangible but show you what they are, and then after you factor those in, you have to take into account what your overhead and costs are for the program. So just unpacking a little bit, very high level, the diversity revenue growth are the kinds of things I talked about earlier that are the kinds of traditional things, new ethnic, new niche, new global markets. Supplier diversity is becoming a significant issue that unfortunately I just won't have the time in this setting to unpack, but I've actually done a lot of work with the NMSDC at a national event, spoke at a breakfast that Magic Johnson's company offered around the ROI for supplier diversity, and had the pleasure with the Houston NMSDC chapter and several others around the country to present that data. If that's an area of interest, reach out to me. I'll share that with you as well. Among the things that get factored into this model include the areas that you see on the screen. But I'm going to drill down and unpack this a little bit more and put some dollars and cents to some of this as we walk through the model. I'm going to actually walk you through an organization with 5,000 employees and what I'll show you relative to the amount of money that was sitting on the table in this organization is absolutely astounding. These are just some of the factors that get calculated and built into the model. This is just another snapshot of how does that now get explained and, from an internal perspective, tracked. We're looking at things like that diversity revenue related growth, those cost reduction numbers, as well as the intangibles. Let me give you an expanded version of this. I mentioned earlier those ways in which, from a consumer market standpoint, you can track growth relative to those niches that may be diverse in its nature. But I mentioned also in that business to business area, their needs are changing and clients are asking to know more about what you're doing as an organization if you're going to be a strategic partner or aligned with them in some way. They're also, depending on the services you offer, I'll give you the example with Blue Beyond. Blue Beyond is in organizations and has been for years doing lots of work in helping them as a strategic partner to address everything from, as I said, creating those internal change programs and processes to assisting them with employee value props and an array of things. But now that we also do diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, there are other avenues in that client relationship that we can sit down and talk to them about where their sources of pain may be and how we can help. It's the same thing relative to your ability internally in organizations to be able to leverage these topics, as I'm going to share, in ways that also increase your revenues. I also wanted to mention again that there are multiple components connected to the investment community that if you are publicly traded, I encourage you to put your arms around those numbers. When I talk about how does this now from an intangible perspective start to manifest, the recruiting and retention issues are key, especially in the current environment. Discretionary effort and how much an employee brings of their capabilities to the workplace is directly connected to how they're treated in the workplace. There are tons of ways employees today are looking to see what's happening in your organization before they come in. And unfortunately, with social media, sometimes the things that are happening behaviorally are being put out in social media platforms in ways that aren't favorable. When it comes to talent management, where we quantify things like how much effort you give has a correlation to asset utilization, and again, I'll show you where that connection is. In this particular model, I won't give you the example connection to reputational capital, but there are several ways in which that can be impacted both positively and negatively, and it is also a part of the conversation around risk mitigation when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'll talk more about number 4 when it comes to culture and alignment as we continue to walk through a couple of other explanations. I also mentioned there is bottom line impact. We talked earlier about the fact that there's a connection between how people are treated in the workplace and what effort they give. That term is discretionary effort, and we're able to quantify how much of that A game do people bring to the table. We also are able to make the connections to the dollars and cents around absenteeism, turnover, and other impacts connected to when disrespectful behaviors are occurring in the workplace. Unfortunately, because of the nature of this work, when there are areas that have those disrespectful behaviors occurring in organizations, there are other costs that are now incurred. Part of that, there are legal costs connected to the things that would be under that broader diversity umbrella. There are multiple associations of attorneys who have sort of baselined what some of those costs are. What's the average if something is resolved before or after? These kinds of legal costs are the things that, unfortunately, the majority of organizations will embrace as their way to define where the business case is. But that's such a small part of the bigger picture, as you'll see in just a second. The other thing you have to also factor in to come up with what your actual earnings are connected to the revenues and expenses connected to your program, obviously, you've got to track the costs connected to the program itself. All of that gets factored into driving the numbers. But a lot of the numbers are going to come back to what I said earlier. It's going to come back to behaviors in the workplace. And unfortunately, the toxic behaviors are getting worse and not better. There's behaviors, or rather there's headlines in the newspaper on a regular basis. Even down to the extent of this one within the last couple of weeks, telling employees that if the workplace is toxic, here are the reasons why you need to leave. HR News, trying to ensure what do those of us who have our fingers on the pulse of what happens with our people do about the toxicity level that's occurring and how it's driving turnover. There's even a connection now to this term that we're hearing over and over again about quiet quitting, and how that's an expected response to the level of toxicity that's occurring in workplaces. My point, this is happening everywhere. This is not a US centric issue. This is an issue that's impacting all workplaces. And you know what? It's not just a workplace issue. If you really think about it, I said earlier, common courtesy, it's just not so common anymore. So when it comes to derailing behaviors, here's what we baselined in our studies. Our approach was taking an academic approach to begin to quantify and discern, was this indeed an area that we needed to now at least report out those findings. So what we did is we looked at what were other studies that had been done that were related to the topics of the derailing behaviors that were most prevalent. And specifically, what were those findings? By derailing behavior, what I'm talking about is the definition you see here. It doesn't matter whether the behavior was intentional or not. And I just want to stop there for a second. I can't tell you how many conversations, coaching-wise, I've had with executives and leaders who've said, I didn't know that was that was disrespectful. I didn't mean for that to be disrespectful. That wasn't my intent. But you don't just own the intent, but you also own the impact. But those on the receiving end have an obligation to share when and how they've been impacted. So derailing behavior, whether it's intentional or not, it sabotages, undermines, or weakens an employee's commitment, passion, or even their willingness to conduct their responsibilities at their full potential. The four that we looked at were these: acts of incivility, general disrespect, if you would, from the Brookings Institution. We looked at micro inequities and work that was done at MIT Sloan Business School, as well as unconscious bias. We looked at bullying behaviors, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of research in the U.S. academically on the topic from a workplace perspective. In the U.S., there are very few laws against it, so we turned overseas for some of the research. Broken dignity entitlements was the fourth. This comes out of a study by the American Academy of Management Executives. Let me unpack these a little. When I talk about acts of incivility, this particular study was basically citing behavior that wasn't just rude or disrespectful, but it was behavior that took away dignity and self-esteem from people. And in this particular study, what they found is that 28% of people self-reported that they lost time avoiding the instigator of the disrespectful behavior. Over half said they'd lost time worrying about the incident of disrespect or future interactions with that person. And 22% said they have decreased their effort at work. Those three data points in particular jumped out at us. We contacted the study coordinators to see, did they quantify how much time was being impacted? They didn't, we did, and I'll explain what we found. We then took a look at this topic of micro inequities and microaggressions, and these are those tiny, subtle forms of discriminatory behaviors, but they're incredibly impactful. Examples are things like people being patronized to appease them, or intentionally ignored to belittle them, or deserving a promotion and being overlooked to punish them. These are examples of what does a micro inequity actually feel like. The third thing we took a look at was the topic of bullying in the workplace. And this is a topic that's very personal for me. Way too often people will associate having a tough boss with being a bully, and that's not what it is. A tough boss is somebody who is dealing with performance issues in the workplace. May have a bad day, may sound like a bully on occasions, but that's not by definition what a bully in the workplace is. Because a workplace bully attacks a person's character, they're humiliating, demeaning, and personal. Let me just unpack this a little bit more for you. There's three consistent threads, according to the Workplace Bullying Institute, that constitute workplace bullying. One, it's personal, not just your performance in the workplace. Two, it's repeated over and over. And three, it's intentional. And the question I'm often asked when having this discussion in organizations is, how do you know if it's intentional? That's easy to answer. If the bully's behavior would change if their boss was around, that's when you know it's intentional. Being a tough boss doesn't make you a bully, but bullying is happening at rampant levels, and it's in every organization. Let me stop for a second. This isn't the bullying webinar. I have done one on that topic, but I don't ever let an opportunity on this conversation pass without saying, because of the prevalence of bullying and how many people are going through it, we had registered for this webinar about 400 people. That means numerically there's about 125 to 150 people who would be watching this webinar who have either experienced or witnessed bullying in the workplace. If you're on the receiving end of bullying, please let me at least plant this seed for you. Number one, you've done nothing to deserve being bullied. In the workplace, the person who is bullied most often is the top producer being bullied by their supervisor who's threatened by them. And they're trying to take your dignity and self-esteem away so you will make mistakes and others may not see you as proficient as you are. But let me also share, that person who is the bully can target you, but only you allow yourself to become a victim. Victimization is a choice. One of my favorite quotes from Dr. King is the following. He was heading into Memphis to go see how he could bring the national media and spotlight in to the sanitation workers who were on strike. And he told them, I'll come and I'll bring the media because they follow me when I come, but you have something you need to do before I get there. He said, before I get there, you need to take one step, and that step is straighten your back up. He said, a man can't ride your back unless it's bent. If you're being bullied, the first step to taking back your power is straightening your back up. Reach out to me after this. I can send you a link to some videos that will be incredibly powerful to help you take your power back. Let me share one more quick anecdote before I move on because this is so powerful and personal. I was doing a workshop in an organization where a lady came up to me at the end of the session. Room had cleared out. I talked about 8 or 10 different kinds of bullies. There's more than that. She said, my boss is every one of those bullies rolled up into one. And every day, once a day, I hear him speaking to my coworkers as he's coming down the hall towards my office. He's being cordial and sociable, but I know that's not what I'm going to get. She said, and every day, once a day, as he's coming towards my office, I reach under my desk, I grab my garbage can, and I throw up into my garbage can. This lady had 2 PhDs, was responsible for multiple patents in the organization, but made very clear that not only was this impacting her from an emotional standpoint, but physical as well. It's unfortunate, but the behaviors happen all the time, and it's happened to me. I'm 6'4", 240 pounds, and I worked for a bully who was about 5 feet tall, African American, and we called her the Black Widow. We were convinced she ate her young, and it was the worst experience that I've ever had in my life. I can tell you right now, it causes you to leave work and go home and snap at people who've said and done nothing at all. You question your own worth. The behaviors are real and they're impactful. And I want you to know that this is one piece we took some extra time in. Just so you know, here in the U.S., there's no law against bullying. Now, they have a requirement in San Francisco. I beg your pardon, now it's in California. They have a requirement to do abusive conduct training. And by definition, abusive conduct is bullying. But there's not a law against it. That training has to be done in connection to sexual harassment training. San Francisco has a no mobbing policy. Mobbing is the term used in Europe for bullying. But as of right now, there is no law against bullying in the U.S. Let me give you some data points. 37% of workers have been bullied. 57% of those being targeted are women. It happens 4 times more than illegal harassment. 62% of people ignore it. 45% report stress problems. 40% never tell anyone. And 72% of bullies are bosses. So how prevalent do these behaviors have to get before you start to get concerned? When we looked at bullying and disrespect and being treated inappropriately in the workplace and the baseline studies we've done, the numbers were minimally 50%, easy for me to say, 57% of employees self-stated that they had witnessed or experienced these behaviors in the last 12 months. We then asked them, did they perceive any of that behavior to have been based on someone's race or gender or age or religion or sexual orientation? Again, remember, people react differently based on their attribute of difference. 61% of those they consider to be based on some diversity related aspect of difference. Disrespect often occurs around the way we're different. If you're the only woman on a team full of men, disrespect will manifest. And let me just share very quickly, in the work that I have been doing over the last 20 plus years, I have found this term diversity to become so incendiary in organizations that I've actually had to address the initial entree into companies using the word respect more than anything else. Because what I was just saying, actually, when you think about it, every aspect of what we do relative to the tenets of our work, you can still get to through the lens and the door of respect. The ways we differ is how disrespect occurs. You're the person with an accent on a team full of people who doesn't have an accent. You're the one who doesn't have a degree on a team full of people with degrees. You're the only woman on a team full of men, or the only man on a team full of women. All of those aspects of difference and all of the things that we try from a perspective to address, we can still get to. But everybody wants to be respected. That way we can bring everyone to the table in this conversation. Disrespect will manifest around the ways that we differ. Remember earlier we were talking about what is the present state today. The layoffs that are occurring are going to affect organizations' diversity departments. The turnover, the uncertainty, that there's a term called quick quitting that's starting to happen almost as much as quiet quitting. And quick quitting is that person who accepts a job offer and within a matter of weeks, if you're lucky, just doesn't come back to work anymore. Virtual workforces. All of these are challenges, and when you add to that, revenue goals are going up, budgets are going to get cut back even more. And there's going to be an increased effort to be able to get to the new numbers and goals as the economy starts to tighten, and you're going to have fewer and fewer people to reach those goals. So the fundamental question I ask organizations is, how many people in your workplace can you afford to underutilize? And I'm willing to wager not many. Why is that a question I would ask? Think about this. We ask people, what percentage of your best efforts do you give at work on a regular basis? Almost 60% of those we asked said they give less than 100% on a regular basis. When we asked what would incentivize you to give more of your best efforts, it was having a boss that treats me with dignity and respect. When we asked why they had stopped giving that best efforts, it was because it became expected and not appreciated. If our goal is to figure out how do we build that relationship where we're strategic in the organization, these are the conversations we've got to start having. This is why in the initial study we started looking at how does the prevalence of these behaviors affect measures that we can indeed quantify. So let's get to some numbers here, and I'll warn you in advance, if you are right brain and not into the numbers, you may get put to sleep at this point, but it may also seem like drinking from a fire hose with some of this. This is a company with 5,000 employees, and the numbers are actuals that we used with their internal team, their executive team, and some of this was also a part of a board presentation. In this case, we needed to be able to demonstrate fiscal connection, so we took some of their numbers, and let me just share very quickly. If there is an interest on your part to know, where is this for your organization? I have 1,000 people. We have 60,000 people. How would we be able to gauge this? There's about 8 or 9 factors that I can ask you to provide me with, and I would, based on the assumption that the prevalence to which behaviors that we've baselined occurred in other organizations, that they're also happening in yours, I can give you a stake in the ground around what that risk factor might be. But without doing the quant and qual work, there's no way to get to an exact. But again, let me start. In this particular instance, $75,000 was the average salary. They had a $25,000 benefits factor, which made the total comp number $100,000. 22 workdays in a month, 12 months in a year is 264 days. We divided $100,000 by the 264 days. That comes up with $380 rounded up per day. Continuing with the numbers. In their case, we looked at voluntary turnover next. Their number of 5,000 employees with a 13% voluntary turnover rate, we start building the numbers. 1% of their total population of 5,000 is 50 people. To come up with turnover replacement costs, most organizations have not done the rigor to know, but if you search, almost any HR database will tell you that the range for replacement costs, depending on an array of factors, whether it's minimum wage jobs or in a chemical and engineering or a chemical and energy plant, it might take 3 years before someone's fully qualified to do the work. Obviously, there's a swing in what that total comp number is. We use the percentages that are given on HR sites is used between 50 to 150% of the total compensation number as a baseline for calculating turnover replacement costs. So we're going to swag it right down the middle between 50 and 150 at 100%. That means the total comp number is $100,000. That was a $75,000 plus the $25,000 in associated benefits. Continuing. That $100,000 is the total comp number. That's also what we're using for turnover replacement. $100,000 times 50 people. That's 1% of the total audience of 5,000. Makes $5 million the dollar amount per percentage point in turnover replacement costs. So every 1% of turnover costs the organization $5 million. Now, at 13% turnover, which was their voluntary turnover number, that's 650 people per year. That turnover cost now at 13% now goes to $65 million annually. Remember, 50% we're going to use as a stake in the ground. That half of those who left because of those diversity-related acts of incivility that people were citing having experienced earlier. So now that diversity-related turnover replacement cost is about half of that 65 mil at 32.5. You'll see that number again in a moment. These are just some of the partial factors that go into the turnover replacement calculations. And again, most organizations don't do this level of rigor to come up with a number. The next number is a TTF day, or time to fill days. How long does it take from the time that person leaves the organization until someone else is in that role? Well, organizations have modified how they calculate TTF days now. Now it's actually being calculated from when someone leaves until when the new person accepts the offer, even if they may not start for another 3 weeks. So here's what we're going to use. 650 is the voluntary turnover. Times 50%, that means 325 based on derailing behaviors that were perceived to be diversity related. 13% turnover at 5,000 people was 650. That's how I got that number. Next number, 325 is half of that, derailing behaviors related to diversity. This organization estimated their time to fill days at 40 days, which is a fairly conservative number, to be honest with you. When you multiply 40 days times the 325 people, that's the diversity-related turnover, that's 13,000 days of lost productivity. The total comp number per day is $380 a day. That's $4.9 million in lost productivity linked to time to fill days, just associated with the diversity-related turnover. Next number. We also had asked people, have you lost time avoiding the person who committed the disrespectful behavior? 57% of people said that they had experienced the behavior. That's 2,800 plus people. When we asked about losing time avoiding the person, we then had a logic-based tool in the survey that asked, in an 8-hour day, how many minutes would you estimate you lose avoiding the person? The average was 15 minutes. And how many days in a 5-day work week? The average was 2 days. And how many weeks does this go on before you're able to resolve it or put it behind you? The average was 10 weeks. That's a total of 5 hours of lost productivity per incident. Let me put this into context. I mentioned to you that I worked for a bully boss. If I simply walked past her office on the way to the conference room, I'd get this. Hey, where the F are you going? I'm heading over to the conference room. For what? Joe asked me to come meet him. Joe, my boss, asked Yo A to come to the conference room and didn't tell me? I don't know whether he told you or not. I just told you he didn't tell me. What are you, stupid too? Yes, that was what my day consisted of. I didn't do this long before I realized I came here looking for a job. I can leave here looking for one. Here's my point. If you call me to meet you in that conference room and I know I got to walk past her office, I'm going the other direction, down the stairwell, across on the bottom floor, coming up on the other side, and then coming to the conference room. How much time am I losing just trying to avoid this? Perfect example for you. Next, we ask how many of these incidents a year do you experience? The average was 2. At 5 hours of lost productivity per incident, times 2,850 people, is 14,000 hours of lost productivity. Dividing that by 8 is 1,781 days of lost productivity. And that's 2 incidents now is an average of 3,500 days of lost productivity times the $380 per day comp is 1.4 million, rounding it up, in lost productivity annually, avoiding this disrespectful person. We also asked, did you lose time worrying about the person and the interaction that you'd had? Of that 57%, we asked the same question. In an 8-hour day, 30 minutes worrying about the person. How many days a week? 3 out of 5. And how many weeks does this go on? This is 17 weeks. They worry a lot longer even than avoiding. When you calculate that out, 30 minutes, 3 days, 17 weeks, it's over 26 hours of lost productivity. Again, average number of incidents was 2. Multiplying the 25.5 hours times the 2,800 plus people is 72,000 hours of lost productivity. Dividing it by 8 is over 9,000 days. Times the 2 incidents is 18,000 plus days. Times the $380 comp per day is another $6.9 million in lost productivity worrying about the incident. Next number. We ask people, what percentage of your best efforts do you give at work on a regular basis? Keep in mind, only you know the answer to that question. Also, we didn't ask people, do you give 100% of the time? We just asked, what percentage of your best efforts do you give on a regular basis? And keep in mind, discretionary effort is defined this way. If the job requires this, but your capability is here, then the distance between those two is at your discretion to bring to the workplace every day. If you choose not to bring that to the workplace and revert back to doing just what's required to avoid being seen as slacking off, they can't touch you because you're doing what the job requires. But if you want a high-performing work team, you want people willing to bring their A game every day. That's what we began quantifying. What we got in the answer was this didn't just illustrate that there were concerns about people who quit and leave we need to be aware of, but we also need to be aware about those who quit and stay, or as the term is now being used, quiet quitting. So let's begin to put another number to this. Discretionary effort. 60% rounded up from that 57% number when we ask people, do you give, or what percentage of your best efforts do you give on a regular basis? 60% self-reported less than 100% of their effort. That means out of the 5,000 employees, 3,000 of them have said, I don't give 100% of the time. Now, if the average compensation is $100,000, and if 5% of that total comp is $5,000, and let's say for the sake of argument that that is the amount that is not being earned, I assure you they're not leaving the door and giving back that 5% that they're not bringing as an effort into the workplace. But let's just assume for the sake of argument that we get 1% more effort from those employees. That 1% additional effort times that $1,000 is another $3 million a year in what would be called discretionary effort impact. Again, there's more. There's a term that most in the financial industry know that they use for gauging an industry or an organization's profitability called the revenue per FTE, revenue per full-time equivalent. In this case, you take the total revenue for the organization, divide that by the total number of employees. In this case, they had a $9 billion annual revenue goal, or revenue received. Out of 5,000 employees, that was a total annual revenue per employee of $1.8 million, a revenue based on 264 days in the year of $6,800 per day. And here's where the numbers now start to add up. Acts of incivility, time spent avoiding, 3,500 days lost. Acts of incivility, time spent worrying, 18,000 days lost. Time to fill days around diversity-related turnover, 13,000 days lost, 34,000 cumulatively. When you multiply that times the revenue per FTE per day, that's $6,800 per day. That's $237 million in lost revenue on an FTE basis. And there's more. When you look at the numbers connected to this, the diversity-related turnover was 32 million. The lost productivity connected to time to fill days was 5 million. Avoiding 1.4. Lost time worrying 6.7. Lost revenue per FTE 237 million. Discretionary effort impact another 3 million. And it doesn't even take into account the impact on safety and lawsuits and an array of other metrics that aren't even qualified in this. Oh, but there's more. If you take that number and you divide it by 30%, 50%, take 75% and toss it out, it's still way too significant for an organization to ignore. When you start looking at this particular organization, that in their case, they operated on a 14% net. That when you looked at the equivalent of what this meant, this was the equivalent of $500 million in revenue. And this wasn't all. There are other numbers that can be factored in as you build your story internally, connected to engagement in the organization, which many of us have done engagement surveys of many types. We found that based on that level of engagement, there were connections to unplanned absences that went up the more you became less engaged. Let me say that differently. If you were higher on the engagement level, your unplanned absences were lower. If you were lower on the engagement scale, your unplanned absences were higher. Safety incidents went up. The employee satisfaction scores also were connected to this. The commendations employees receive, the numbers of complaints they receive. There's so many data points that can correlate to this in ways that build your numbers. But I'm going to ask you to keep in mind that top row as I build this to a close. Those numbers in particular talk about unplanned absences. Those that are in that highly engaged, they have unplanned absences as well, but their number averages about 3.5 days a year. Those that are in that withdrawn, simply come in, collect my check, and I go home, is about 12 days, a little over 11. The differences between these two is what the numbers, those who are highly committed miss about 3.4 days. Those who are just come in, collect a check, 5.4. There's a 2-day difference. Those that are withdrawn, there's a 7.8 day difference. Take a look. When I said unplanned absences, I'm talking about illnesses or childcare arrangements breaking down or just an array of things that happen in life, okay? Here's a couple of numbers just to share with you. 5,000 employees. That's 67% of those employees that fit that work pays the bill category missed 10,000 more days than the baseline. That category of those who are, let's just say, retired on active duty, missed 7.8 days more than the baseline. That's another 49,000 days of lost productivity. And when you connect that to lost revenue per FTE, there's another third of $1 billion that calculates into this number. When you look at it, it doesn't take into effect the overtime that gets paid to others or payment to temps to fill in or productivity going down because people have to work extra hours to cover. Last number I want to share, creativity and innovation. We asked in the survey if people had ideas around any of these categories that they could have submitted at work. 23% of those consistently have said, nope, nothing of that sort. But the inverse, when you look at those numbers, is saying that 77% of employees have stuff that they could submit suggestions and ideas for. The irony is the majority of them, when you ask, did you submit those ideas? The largest percentage that said, I've submitted all the ideas that I can think of was 40%. After that, 27% said I tried in the past but got no response. Another 22% said my input doesn't seem to be wanted. If your culture is not welcoming and inclusive and accepting, people are not going to bring forward the ideas and suggestions. So what does this mean money-wise? Let me just put some dollars and cents to this. We baselined out of 5,000 employees. What does this mean? That out of those percentages you see of people who said they had ideas connected to those topics, you're looking at improving processes in production, 19% of the 5,000. That's 950 ideas. There's a cumulative total of 3,800 ideas that these employees were sitting on and had never submitted. We went through an analysis of some of these to get a baseline on what might the value to an idea of these sorts be. The range went all over the place, some into seven figures with a single idea. But their baseline they were comfortable using was $150,000 difference with some of these billing or safety or customer service ideas. Then if you took into account viability-wise, assumption after looking through and doing a due diligence was about 1 out of 5 of these we can actually make work. That's about 700 plus. Now, how many of these would we actually then implement? Let's say 10% of those. That's almost 80. And now the value of that 80 ideas times 150,000 is another $11 million in impact. So, as you can see, just looking at the impact on revenue per FTE, these numbers change the conversation. Now when you're sitting down to have the discussions with leaders, now you have an opportunity to speak their language. My hope is that there is an interest. I have a white paper on this topic that has the processes explained in it. I'd be more than happy to forward out to you. My email address you see on the screen. I'll be happy to provide that email or that document to you as a PDF. Also, if you're interested in knowing what the numbers are in your organization, reach out to me. I'll share with you the data points that I need, and I can build the numbers for your organization. I have multiple occasions already lined up, some just recently completed, where the presentation of these numbers has been made to the executive teams of organizations. I've never made the presentations yet where there hasn't been an aha moment that budget comes back up around if we put X into addressing these issues and we can mitigate that by whatever the percentage is that we're anticipating, that return on X I can't get in many other places. That's what the real return on inclusion is when the organization can see that not only is it the right thing to do, but it makes good business sense as well. Because every leader is going to have their feet held to the fire in some capacity or another. Just be aware, next year we are going to be doing another benchmark study. We would love to know if you're interested in participating. It will connect to everything you see there: disrespectful behaviors, margin, performance, productivity, all of the intelligences that our leaders need to possess: emotional, social, and cultural. Again, there's more info we'll send if you're interested. Please take a moment to log on to bluebeyondconsulting.com and get a better feel for what it is that we do as an organization. As I said, it's just incredible the depth of the capabilities that we have within the company. Lastly, at this upcoming study, the focus areas is going to be looking at, as the index tool does already, manager skills, employee perceptions around various organizational processes, as well as areas that now give that fiscal connection. So, as I close this out and give you all a few minutes back to your day today, I want to leave you with a thought. I was told about a story connecting to two relief pilots who had flown a mission into the jungle. And as they had started to take off to return back to go load the plane up in town again, the young co-pilot heard a noise in the cockpit. And he turned and looked and saw there was a snake on board the plane. So he turned to the captain and he said, "Cap, somehow or another the ground crew, while we were on the ground, managed to let a snake get in here. Sir, you need to turn the plane around so we can get this thing out of here and get it back down on the ground." Captain didn't say a word, pushed forward on the throttle, and kept climbing. A few minutes later, the snake starts to ease over by the chair, and the co-pilot says, "Cap, sir, maybe you didn't hear me. Sir, there's not a snake on the plane. Sir, there's a snake on the plane. Please, let's turn this thing around so we can get it out of here and get the plane back on the ground." Again, not a word said. Captain just kept climbing. Well, now the snake is no longer moving. And the young guy looks down at the snake and he says, "Cap, I don't know why, but I get the impression this snake's dead." "You knew it was going to die, didn't you? How could you have possibly known that, though?" First time he spoke, Cap said, "Listen to me. I've been flying planes a long time. And the one thing I learned very early is that snakes can't live at high altitudes. When you go to battle to try to keep the budget, to try to keep these practices and processes in place, oh, the snakes are going to come out. when you keep having these discussions about how important this is if we're going to keep the best and the brightest, and I know you're thinking budgets need to be cut, but we're cutting the rug out from under people if we do this. The snakes are going to come out. And when they do, push forward on the throttle. Keep climbing. Remember, snakes can't live at high altitudes. If we can be of any assistance on your journey, reach out. More than happy to send you the white paper. More than happy to be a resource. More than happy to be a trusted advisor. Thank you for the opportunity. I hope this has been helpful in some way. And again, continue the fight. The battle is absolutely still ongoing. Have a great day.